Picture this: a fierce storm rages along the banks of the Tiber River, the wind howling through the reeds as the swollen waters rush past. Amid the chaos, a desperate cry pierces the night, not from a human, but from a she-wolf, her golden eyes catching the faint glow of moonlight. She moves cautiously toward a basket caught in the roots of a fig tree, and inside, wrapped in tattered cloth, lie two newborn twins. These are no ordinary children. According to legend, they are Romulus and Remus, the abandoned sons of a princess and the god Mars, left to die by a king terrified of their destiny. But fate has other plans. The wolf does not attack. Instead, she nurtures them, sheltering the boys in her den as if they were her own. This moment, myth or miracle, would change the course of history, birthing the legend of Rome itself. For centuries, this story has captivated hearts and minds, blurring the line between history and myth. Was there truly a she-wolf who saved the founders of Rome? Or is this a symbolic tale, woven to explain the city's fierce and untamed origins? Scholars have debated, archaeologists have dug, and yet the mystery endures. What we do know is that Rome's founding is a tapestry of 26 extraordinary legends, each thread more fascinating than the last. Divine prophecies, sibling rivalries, and the audacious vision of a city destined to rule the world. These stories aren't just relics of the past, they're the foundation of an empire that shaped laws, languages, and even the way we think about power today. So join me as we step into the shadows of time where myth and history collide. Together, we'll sift through ancient texts, examine crumbling ruins, and piece together the puzzle of Rome's beginnings. Were Romulus and Remus real figures, or symbols of something greater? Why did one brother ultimately kill the other? And what does the she-wolf truly represent? The answers might surprise you. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a reflection of humanity itself. Our thirst for greatness, our struggles for power, and the legends we create to make sense of it all. By the end of this journey, you won't just know the myths, you'll feel them, alive and pulsing through the streets of Rome, even now. The image of the she-wolf bending protectively over the twins is one of the most enduring symbols of Rome, but this wasn't just a bedtime story. To the Romans, the she-wolf represented something far deeper. In a world where survival was precarious, her act of mercy mirrored their own ideals, strength tempered with compassion, wildness refined into civilization. Ancient artists carved her image into coins and statues, her muscular body arching over the boys as if to say, this is how Rome began, not with a crown but with a struggle. The famous Capitoline wolf statue, cast in bronze over 2,500 years ago, still stands today, her watchful gaze a reminder of the city's humble, almost feral origins. But here's where the legend gets tangled. Some historians argue the she-wolf wasn't a wolf at all. The Latin word lupa could mean both wolf and, in slang, prostitute. Could the boys have been rescued by a marginalized woman, her story later mythologized? Others point to wolf-rearing rituals among neighboring tribes, a symbolic coming-of-age trial. Whatever the truth, the she-wolf's tale became a cornerstone of Roman identity. Even Renaissance painters like Rubens couldn't resist reimagining the scene, draping the wolf in almost human tenderness, as if to bridge the gap between beast and divine. This wasn't just about survival, it was about destiny. The twins' abandonment and rescue echoed a theme Romans loved, the idea that greatness emerges from adversity. Just as the wolf nurtured them, Rome would later nurture conquered peoples, assimilating them into its empire. And let's not forget the twins' divine bloodline. Their mother, Re Silvia, was a priestess sworn to celibacy, yet she bore them to Mars, the god of war. Their birth was both sacred and scandalous, a paradox that would follow them and Rome forever. So when Romulus later draws his first city boundary, etching it into the earth with a plow, remember, this is a story about contradictions, wildness and order, mercy and violence, the human and the divine. The she-wolf didn't just save 2 infants, she set the stage for an empire built on myths as much as marble. If the she-wolf gave Romulus and Remus life, their divine blood gave them purpose. According to legend, their mother Re Silvia was no ordinary princess, she was a Vestal virgin, sworn to 30 years of celibacy under penalty of death. So when she claimed the god Mars himself had visited her in sacred flames, her uncle King Amuleus saw not a miracle, but a threat. The twins' very existence defied both mortal and divine law, making their survival all the more extraordinary. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a cosmic rebellion. By tying Rome's founders to Mars, the mythmakers did something brilliant. They transformed a tale of abandonment into one of destiny. What king could question the legitimacy of a city born from the god of war's own sons? The Greeks had their own stories of demigod founders, Hercules battling monsters, Perseus slaying Medusa, but Rome's version was different. Where Greek heroes often struggled against their divine lineage, Romulus and Remus embraced theirs. Mars wasn't a distant figure in their myth, he was active, almost palpable. Roman poets described him as Father Mars, his presence thrumming through every battle standard and city wall. This wasn't just symbolism, it was propaganda. By the time Augustus ruled, coins bore the twins suckling the she-wolf beside Mars' helmet, a visual manifesto. Rome's militarism wasn't choice, it was divine inheritance. Yet cracks appear when we scrape the gilded surface. Early Roman historians like Fabius Pictor barely mentioned Mars in their accounts. Some scholars argue the god's paternity was grafted onto the myth centuries later, a political tool to unify Rome's warlike tribes under a shared celestial banner. Even the name Mars might hold clues. Originally an agricultural deity called Mavers, his identity was sharpened into a god of war as Rome expanded. The twins' myth then becomes a mirror, reflecting not just who they were, but who Rome wanted to be. But divine blood doesn't fill empty stomachs. However celestial their origins, the twins' early years were startlingly human. Found by the shepherd Faustulus, whose name literally means little lucky one, they grew up not in palaces but in the rough simplicity of the hills. Faustulus and his wife Laurentia raised them as herders, teaching them to track wolves, mend fences, and navigate the politics of rural Latium. This duality, God-touched yet earthbound, became Rome's blueprint. The city would always balance 2 souls, one reaching for the heavens, the other rooted in soil and sweat. When Romulus later plowed that first sacred furrow around Palatine Hill, he wasn't just drawing a boundary, he was stitching together the divine and the mundane, the wild and the tamed, just as his own life had been stitched together by fate. Faustulus wasn't just a shepherd, he was the quiet architect of Rome's destiny. Picture him bending over that woven basket in the riverbank reeds, his calloused hands trembling as he peeled back the damp cloth to reveal the twins. In that moment, a humble man became the bridge between myth and reality. Roman writers painted Faustulus as a figure of instinctive kindness, a man who didn't hesitate to defy the king's orders. But his role went beyond rescue. His farm on Palatine Hill became the twins' first kingdom, a world of dirt-floored huts and grazing flocks where Romulus and Remus learned the raw skills that would shape Rome: how to defend territory from wolves, negotiate grazing rights with neighbors, and read the land like a map. This wasn't just survival training, it was statesmanship in its simplest form. Archaeologists have unearthed post holes and pottery shards on Palatine dating back to the 8th century BC, roughly the era the legends describe. These aren't grand palaces, but the remains of wattle and daub huts, their floors hardened by centuries of trampling feet. One discovery stands out: a stone-lined pit filled with votive offerings, miniature spears, clay figurines of nursing wolves, suggesting this spot was revered long before marble temples rose. Could this be Faustulus's homestead, later sanctified by memory? The overlap is tantalizing. The twins' pastoral upbringing wasn't just a poetic contrast to their future glory. It mirrored Rome's own trajectory from clustered huts to a city that would literally move mountains to build its aqueducts. Yet even idyllic beginnings have shadows. As teenagers, the twins began hearing whispers about their striking resemblance to the deposed royal line, about the shepherd who always seemed to watch them too carefully. Then came the day their herd strayed onto King Amuleus's lands. When Remus was captured for trespassing, the confrontation that followed ripped away the veil of their ordinary lives. Brought before the king, Remus's defiant glare, so like his mother Silvia's, triggered a chilling recognition. Amuleus had spent years believing the twins were dead, their bones picked clean by Tiber's currents. Now here stood living proof of his niece's forbidden children, their very existence a death sentence for his reign. What happened next wasn't just a family drama, it was the spark that would ignite a revolution. Faustulus, realizing secrecy was lost, rushed to Romulus with the truth. Their royal blood, their uncle's treachery, the fate that had been waiting for them all along. The shepherd who'd spent years teaching them to mend fences now handed them a far sharper tool: knowledge of who they truly were. And in that moment, the pastoral world of sheepfolds and starry nights collided with destiny. The boys who'd once played at being kings among the flocks would now become kings in earnest, their first act not construction but vengeance. Palatine's quiet hillside was about to echo with the clash of swords and the cries of a dynasty reborn. The moment Romulus learned the truth about his birthright, the hills of Latium became a battleground. With Faustulus's revelation still ringing in his ears, he rallied the shepherds and outcasts who'd grown up alongside them, men with calloused hands and grudges against Amuleus's heavy taxes. Meanwhile, Remus, imprisoned in the king's dungeons, turned his cell into a rallying point, whispering promises of liberation to guards swayed by his eerie resemblance to their deposed former king, Numa. This wasn't just a revolt, it was a reckoning. The twins moved like twin storms, Romulus from the countryside, Remus from within the city walls, until they converged on Amuleus's palace in a clash of spears and fury. Ancient historians like Livy describe the king's death in stark terms, not as a battle but an execution. The man who'd once ordered infants drowned now met his end at the hands of those very children, a poetic justice that would echo through Rome's later myths. But here's where history and legend blur. Amuleus's tyranny mirrors real power struggles in 8th century BC Italy, where petty kings often ruled through fear. Archaeologists note a pattern of fortified settlements toppled around this time, charred layers in the soil suggesting violent regime changes. Was Amuleus one of these warlords, his name preserved in folklore? Or was he invented as a cautionary tale, a symbol of the hubris that comes with unjust rule? Even the twins' tactics feel suspiciously strategic. Their uprising follows a classic pattern seen in later Roman revolts, exploiting discontent among the lower classes, flipping loyalties within the ruling guard, and striking at the heart of power. It's as if the story was retrofitted to justify Rome's own expansionist violence. After all, what empire doesn't claim its founders were freedom fighters? The aftermath left the brothers with an unexpected dilemma. With Amuleus dead and their grandfather Numa restored to Alba Longa's throne, they could have lived as princes in an existing kingdom. But destiny had other plans. The same stubbornness that fueled their rebellion now drove them to carve out something new. Numa, perhaps wary of their ambition, granted them land to build their own city, a seemingly generous offer that masked a political calculation. By sending them away, he removed two potential rivals while extending his influence. The twins, however, saw only opportunity. As they stood on the banks of the Tiber, surveying the 7 hills, they faced a question that would define centuries to come. Where does one even begin to build an eternal city? Their choice would hinge on more than geography. Romulus, ever the pragmatist, favored Palatine Hill, its steep slopes naturally defensible, its springs reliable. Remus the dreamer argued for Aventine, a gentler rise with sweeping views symbolizing openness. This debate wasn't just about real estate, it encapsulated Rome's future identity. Would it be a fortress or a crossroads, a warlord's stronghold or a trader's hub? The tension between their visions simmered as they turned to the oldest method of decision-making in their world, divination. Each brother climbed his chosen hill to watch for omens in the flight of birds, a practice as common then as consulting a map would be today. But when Remus spotted 6 vultures to Romulus's 12, the dispute turned deadly. What began as a contest of signs became a flashpoint for all their unresolved rivalry, setting the stage for a betrayal that would stain Rome's origin story forever. The contest of the birds wasn't just a sibling squabble, it was a cosmic courtroom with the gods themselves as jurors. As dawn broke over the Tiber, Romulus and Remus climbed their chosen hills, each clutching a staff carved with sacred markings. The air hummed with tension. In Roman tradition, augury, reading the will of the gods through bird flight, wasn't superstition. It was statecraft. Every consul, every general sought these signs before major decisions. So when Remus spotted 6 vultures circling Aventine Hill, he shouted in triumph. 6 was a sacred number associated with harmony. But Romulus, standing barefoot on Palatine's rocky crest, stayed silent until 12 broad-winged shadows crossed the sun. His voice, when it came, was steel. The gods have spoken twice over. Scholars still debate what really happened that morning. Some argue Remus saw his birds first, making his claim technically valid. But Romulus, ever the strategist, waited for a grander omen. Others suggest the 12 vultures were a later addition to the myth, invented to justify Romulus's supremacy. The deeper truth lies in what the birds represented. Vultures weren't just scavengers to the early Latins. They were purifiers clearing battlefields of corruption. Their appearance signaled not just divine favor, but a grim promise. This land would be fed by sacrifice. The brothers' reactions revealed their core differences. Remus, ever the idealist, took his 6 vultures as a sign to build a city of balance. Romulus, with his 12, saw a mandate for expansion, a Rome that would dominate, not merely exist. Their clash wasn't just about hilltops, it was a referendum on power itself. When Remus later leaped over Romulus's freshly dug city walls in contempt, mocking their modest height, he wasn't just breaching a boundary. He was challenging the very notion of limits, a provocation that could only end one way. The spear that struck him down, whether wielded by Romulus or a loyal lieutenant, didn't just kill a man. It etched Rome's founding principle into history, unity at any cost, even brothers' blood. Yet the tragedy raises haunting questions. Was Romulus truly the chosen founder, or merely the better storyteller? Ancient historians noted that 12 vultures later appeared to other generals before victories, a suspiciously convenient pattern. And what of the she-wolf's legacy? The beast who'd shown mercy now watched as her foster sons turned on each other, their rivalry echoing the wolf pack's own brutal hierarchies. Perhaps the real omen wasn't in the birds at all, but in what their contest revealed, that Rome's destiny was never about divine will, but human hunger for land, for glory, for a story grand enough to justify both. The walls Romulus raised that day weren't just made of earth. They were built on paradox, a city forever torn between its noble ideals and the blood required to defend them. The moment Remus leaped over that freshly dug furrow, the air itself seemed to freeze. To modern eyes, it might look like a petty stunt, a brother mocking his twin's handiwork. But in 8th century BC Italy, that shallow trench wasn't just dirt. It was a sacred line drawn with rituals older than memory. By crossing it, Remus didn't just insult Romulus, he violated the pomerium, the spiritual boundary that separated order from chaos, civilization from wilderness. Roman writers describe what happened next in chilling simplicity. Romulus struck him down with a single blow. Some versions claim it was Romulus's own hand. Others say a loyal follower acted on his unspoken command. Either way, the message was clear. In the new Rome, boundaries were not suggestions, they were blood oaths. This wasn't merely murder, it was myth-making. Ancient historians like Livy framed the act as tragic but necessary, a grim lesson in the cost of unity. Later Romans would point to Remus's death as proof that their city was forged not through compromise, but through ruthless conviction. Yet the story's psychological layers run deeper. Freudian scholars see it as a primal struggle between ego and ID Romulus, the disciplined founder, eliminating his reckless shadow self. Political theorists read it differently, a calculated purge, removing the only person who could challenge Romulus's authority. Even the geography whispers secrets. Palatine Hill, where Romulus stood victorious, would later house emperors. Aventine, Remus's choice, became the plebeian stronghold. Was their fatal clash a prophecy of Rome's eternal class wars? The Romans themselves seemed torn about how to remember Remus. Early art rarely depicts his death, as if ashamed of the violence at their origin. But by the Republic's end, coins show the she-wolf with both twins, a subtle rehabilitation. Perhaps they realized a nation can't thrive on guilt alone. The real genius of the myth lies in its ambiguity. Romulus wasn't glorified as a hero. He was haunted, spending nights in a thatched hut like a common farmer, as if trying to outrun his deed. His first law, asylum. He declared Rome a refuge for outcasts, murderers, and runaway slaves, men who, like him, had blood on their hands. It was an admission wrapped in a paradox. The founder who killed his brother would fill his city with brothers in exile. Now came the practical problem. Walls and laws meant nothing without people to guard them. Romulus's solution was as bold as it was controversial. He sent word across the 7 hills, "Come to Rome, no questions asked." But the desperate souls who arrived were almost all men, hardened shepherds, fugitives, soldiers of fortune. A city couldn't grow without mothers, without children. What happened next would become Rome's most infamous legend, one that still sparks debate 2,700 years later. The stage was set for an act so shocking, it would make Remus's death seem like a prelude, the abduction of the Sabine women. Rome's survival hung by a thread in those early days, a city of rough-handed men with no wives, no families, no future. Romulus faced an impossible choice: let his newborn city wither or take drastic action. What happened next wasn't just a raid, it was a calculated act of desperation that would echo through millennia. The Festival of Consues, a harvest celebration, became the stage for history's most infamous mass abduction. Romulus invited the neighboring Sabine tribes, men, women, and children, to games honoring the god of stored grain. As chariots raced and wine flowed, the Roman men struck, seizing 600 Sabine women in a coordinated frenzy. Livy's account describes the chaos: mothers screaming, daughters ripped from their families, the sacred festival grounds transformed into a battleground. But this wasn't mindless violence. The Romans reportedly swore an oath to treat the women with honor, offering marriage and shared property rights, privileges most Sabine women lacked under their own laws. Here lies the legend's central tension. Was this a brutal crime or a harsh but necessary foundation for a society? Ancient historians framed it as a tragic compromise. Plutarch claims Romulus himself negotiated with the women, promising them citizenship and veto power over their husbands' decisions, a radical notion for the time. Modern archaeologists note a curious detail. 7th century BC graves near Rome show Sabine-style jewelry beside Roman pottery, suggesting some cultural blending did occur. Artists across centuries have grappled with the moral quicksand of this story. Renaissance painters like Rubens depicted the moment with Baroque drama, muscled Romans hoisting swooning maidens against stormy skies. Jacques-Louis David's neoclassical version turned it into political allegory, the women pleading for unity as the French Revolution loomed. Picasso's brutalist sketches stripped away romance, showing the abduction as raw geometric violence. Each interpretation reflects its era's anxieties about power, gender, and nation-building. Even the word rape carries debate. The Latin raptio meant abduction, not necessarily sexual violence, though later accounts conflated the two. The aftermath proved more surprising than the crime itself. When the enraged Sabine king Titus Tatius marched on Rome, the abducted women, now wives and mothers, reportedly rushed onto the battlefield, clutching infants to their chests. According to legend, they demanded peace, declaring loyalty to both their Roman husbands and Sabine fathers. This moment of mediation became Rome's first lesson in assimilation. The Sabines weren't conquered, they were incorporated, their gods added to Roman temples, their leaders sharing power. Tatius even ruled jointly with Romulus for 5 years until his mysterious death. The deeper truth may lie in the soil. Excavations show Sabine settlements on the Quirinal Hill, gradually merging with Rome's Palatine community in the 8th century BC. Shared water systems, intermarried graves, and blended religious cults all point to a slower, more organic integration than the legend suggests. Perhaps the abduction story was a mythic shorthand for generations of negotiation, intermarriage, and cultural exchange, a dramatic origin for Rome's greatest strength, its ability to absorb others. By the time Virgil wrote the Aeneid, the Sabines were remembered not as victims but as ancestors. Their bloodline flowed into Rome's patrician class, their warrior spirit celebrated in the very ideal of Roman virtue. What began as a crime became, in hindsight, the first stitch in the tapestry of an empire built not on purity, but on the audacious idea that anyone could become Roman. The Sabine War wasn't just a clash of spears, it was a battle for Rome's soul. Imagine Titus Tatius, king of the Sabines, standing atop the Quirinal Hill, his warriors' shields glinting in the sun as they prepared to storm the fledgling city below. Their fury was righteous. Romulus's abduction of their daughters and sisters wasn't just a crime, it was an existential threat to their honor and lineage. But Rome's founder had anticipated this. The city's gates were barred, its makeshift walls manned by men who knew they were fighting not just for territory, but for survival. What followed wasn't a conventional war, but a series of brutal skirmishes and sieges, the kind of grinding conflict that would define Rome's future military ethos. At the heart of the legend stands a moment so dramatic it feels lifted from epic poetry. As the two armies clashed in the valley between the hills, the abducted Sabine women, now wives and mothers, raced onto the battlefield. Hair unbound, infants clutched to their chests. They positioned themselves between the opposing forces, their voices cutting through the din of combat. According to Livy, they cried out to both sides, "If you cannot bear to live as kinsmen, then strike through us the mothers who bind you." This wasn't just a plea for peace, it was a political masterstroke. By framing themselves as the connective tissue between two peoples, the women transformed their trauma into a foundation for unity. The reconciliation that followed reveals Rome's genius for turning enemies into allies. Tatius and Romulus didn't just sign a truce, they formed a joint kingship, merging Sabine and Roman traditions. Sabine gods like Quirinus were enshrined on Rome's Palatine Hill, their rituals woven into the civic calendar. Sabine nobles gained seats in the Senate, their clans intermarrying with Rome's founding families. Even the city's name took on new layers. Some scholars argue Roma might derive from a Sabine word for river. This wasn't conquest, it was alchemy, transforming grievance into shared identity. But how much of this reflects real history? Archaeologists note a surge in Sabine-style pottery and burial practices in Rome around the 8th century BC, suggesting cultural exchange. Yet the war's grand narrative likely masks generations of negotiation. The Sabines weren't a monolith but a collection of clans, some of whom may have allied with Rome willingly. The legend's true power lies in its symbolism. It became Rome's origin story for empire building. Every time Rome later absorbed a conquered people, granting citizenship to Gauls, sharing power with Etruscans, they pointed back to the Sabines as proof that assimilation was their destiny. Romulus's reign after the war takes on an almost eerie quality. Having secured Rome's survival through blood and diplomacy, he ruled for decades, shaping laws and rituals that would endure for centuries. Then, one day, as he stood reviewing his troops on the Campus Martius, a storm descended, not the gentle rain of spring, but a howling tempest of thunder and black clouds. When the skies cleared, Romulus was gone. Some claimed Mars had swept him to the heavens. Others whispered that the senators, weary of his tyrannical streak, had torn him apart in secret. His disappearance became Rome's first great mystery, a void filled with divine speculation and political intrigue. The man who'd built a city on brotherly betrayal would now become its eternal ghost, worshipped as the god Quirinus, yet forever haunting the empire he'd willed into existence. The storm that swallowed Romulus wasn't just weather. It was a cosmic vanishing act, one that would haunt Rome for centuries. That fateful day on the Campus Martius began like any other military review, the clatter of armor, the rhythmic tramp of sandals on dust. Then, without warning, the sky darkened as if night had fallen at noon. Lightning split the heavens, thunder shaking the earth hard enough to knock men to their knees. When the tempest passed, Romulus's throne stood empty. Some swore they'd seen a whirlwind lift him skyward, his crimson cloak billowing like a banner of flame. Others whispered of a shadowy conspiracy, senators who'd grown weary of his autocratic rule, their knives hidden beneath ceremonial robes. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The founder who'd built Rome on blood and vision had left no corpse to bury, only a legend to worship. This wasn't just a Roman story. Across ancient cultures, vanishing kings haunt the collective imagination. King Arthur carried to Avalon's misty shores after Camlan's battle. The Mesopotamian hero Gilgamesh ascending to the stars after his quest for immortality. Even in modern times, figures like Elvis or Amelia Earhart captivate us precisely because they disappeared without closure. Psychologists call it the need for cognitive completion. Our brains rebel against unresolved endings. For Rome, Romulus's apotheosis served a deeper purpose. By transforming him into the god Quirinus, they turned a potentially destabilizing mystery into a state religion. His temple on the Quirinal Hill became a pilgrimage site, his festival, the Quirinalia, a day of civic unity. The message was clear. Rome's founder hadn't died, he'd transcended, watching over his city like Mars before him. But peel back the myth and contradictions emerge. Early Roman historians like Ennius hinted at Senate involvement, describing how the patricians divided his body among themselves, a chilling metaphor for power sharing. Archaeologists note a curious pattern. 7th century BCE graves near the campus Marcius contain fragments of weapons and shattered pottery, as if violence had erupted there. Could these be traces of a coup, later sanitized by myth? The timing is suspicious. Romulus had just survived an assassination attempt by disgruntled senators shortly before his disappearance. His subsequent purge of political rivals left Rome's elite seething. Even the whirlwind story carries echoes of earlier Etruscan rituals, where kings were symbolically carried off to legitimize transitions of power. What makes Romulus's apotheosis unique is its political brilliance. Unlike Arthur's passive, sleeping king myth, Quirinus was an active deity. His priesthood, the Flame Quirinoles, held veto power in religious matters. His sacred spear, the Histor Quirini, was paraded during crises as a reminder of Rome's martial roots. Most tellingly, when later generals like Sulla or Caesar sought divine parallels, they didn't choose Jupiter or Mars, they invoked Quirinus, the king who became a god without dying. This wasn't just piety, it was realpolitik wrapped in celestial imagery. With Romulus gone, Rome faced its first succession crisis, and the solution would shape centuries of governance. The Senate invented the interregnum, a temporary rulership where power rotated among elders every 5 days. It was a stopgap measure, but it revealed Rome's emerging identity, a city skeptical of monarchy yet terrified of chaos. The legends of the 6 kings who followed Romulus, Numa, Pompilius the pious, Tullus, Hostilius the warlike, read like a laboratory of leadership styles. Numa's establishment of priestly colleges and sacred calendars mirrored Rome's need for structure after Romulus's turbulent reign. Tullus's aggressive wars against Alba Longa showed the flip side, a city forever oscillating between discipline and expansion. The most fascinating figure in this shadowy period isn't a king at all, but a woman, the Vestal Virgin Tarpea. Her betrayal of Rome's citadel to the Sabines, motivated by greed for golden armbands, or so the story goes, ended with her being crushed under the enemy's shields. Yet her name endured in the Tarpeian rock, the cliff from which traitors were later hurled. Like Romulus's apotheosis, Tarpea's tale is less about history than psychology. Rome was crafting its moral compass through these stories, defining what it meant to be Roman through contrast. Where Romulus embodied the ideal founder, Tarpeia became the anti-myth, a warning against disloyalty in a city still figuring out its identity. These early legends, however embellished, reveal a startling truth. Rome's foundation was never set in stone. It was a living narrative, rewritten with each generation's anxieties and ambitions. The kings who followed Romulus, some real, some likely invented, served as mirrors, reflecting the values Rome wished to champion or condemn. By the time the Republic emerged 2 centuries later, these stories had become scripture, their lessons etched into law and ritual. That's the real miracle of Romulus's vanishing act. He didn't just leave behind a city, he left a story elastic enough to stretch across millennia, adapting to every crisis, every empire, every reinvention, a myth that could weather even the fall of Rome itself. After the storm of Romulus's reign with its fratricide, abductions, and vanishing kings, Rome needed a different kind of leader. Enter Numa Pompilius, a man who seemed to walk out of a pastoral poem rather than a battlefield. Where Romulus wore a wolf's ferocity, Numa carried the quiet authority of a philosopher. Chosen by the Senate for his reputation as a wise Sabine hermit, he initially refused the throne, claiming he preferred the company of oak trees and mountain springs to the chaos of politics. But Rome's elders insisted. Their fledgling city, still reeling from decades of violence, needed stability, not more spears. What followed was a reign so transformative it would shape Roman identity for centuries, all because of a whisper in the woods. Legend claims Numa's wisdom came from divine midnight meetings with the nymph Egeria, who taught him sacred laws beside a secluded spring. Historians debate whether Egeria was a deity, a human priestess, or pure myth, but her influence was undeniable. Through her, Numa claimed to receive Rome's first religious blueprint, the establishment of priestly colleges, the division of the year into sacred and profane days, even the invention of the Vestal Virgins. These 6 priestesses, sworn to 30 years of celibacy, tended the eternal flame in Vesta's temple, a symbol of Rome's endurance. Their role wasn't just spiritual, it was political. By entrusting women with the city's sacred heart, Numa signaled that peace required more than swords, it required collective faith. Archaeologists have found traces of Numa's reforms in the oldest layers of Roman ritual. The calendar he allegedly introduced, with its festivals like the Feriae Latini, matches agricultural cycles known to 8th century BC farmers. The Temple of Janus, whose doors were closed in times of peace, stood as a physical barometer of Numa's success. They reportedly didn't open once during his 43-year reign. Even the Vestal's round temple, unearthed near the Palatine, aligns with descriptions of Numa's designs, but the real genius of his rule lay in its contradictions. This was a king who banned blood sacrifices yet institutionalized war rituals, who preached pacifism but created the Salii, 12 priests who danced through Rome clashing sacred shields, a reminder that even peace had its martial rhythms. Numa's legacy wasn't just about softening Rome's edges. He understood that empires need myths as much as armies. By claiming direct dialogue with the divine, he gave Rome something Romulus never could, a sense of cosmic order. Where Romulus's apotheosis happened after death, Numa lived like a mortal god, his every act steeped in ritual. He didn't conquer neighbors, he charmed them, inviting their deities into Rome's pantheon. The Sabine god Quirinus, once worshipped by Titus Tatius's people, became Jupiter's equal. Etruscan augurs found their bird divination techniques formalized as state policy. This wasn't just tolerance, it was spiritual diplomacy, turning potential enemies into stakeholders in Rome's destiny. Yet for all his piety, Numa was a political realist. His creation of guilds for bakers, potters, and metalworkers gave Rome's plebeians a voice centuries before the Republic. His redistribution of lands Romulus had seized from neighboring tribes eased tensions without appearing weak. Even his refusal to wear royal purple, opting instead for plain wool, was a masterstroke of image building, a king who ruled by moral authority rather than force. Modern leaders might call it soft power. Numa called it pax deorum, the peace of the gods, but peace, like the nymph Egeria herself, proved fleeting. When Numa died in his sleep at 80, no storm, no daggers, just a quiet passing Rome faced a dilemma. His successor, Tullus Hostilius, would inherit a city transformed yet restless. The same senators who'd once begged Numa to rule now whispered that his piety had made Rome soft. The Temple of Janus's doors creaked on their hinges, eager to swing wide. The stage was set for a king who'd answer the call not of nymphs, but of trumpets, a ruler who'd prove that Rome's soul was, and always would be, a battleground between war and wisdom. Tullus Hostilius stormed into Rome's history like a thunderclap, a king who worshipped war as devoutly as Numa had worshipped peace. Where his predecessor sought counsel from nymphs in moonlit groves, Tullus kept his eyes locked on the horizon, where Rome's rival, Alba Longa, loomed like a shadow. The two cities had skirmished for generations over grazing lands and trade routes, but Tullus saw an opportunity not just for victory, but for spectacle. Instead of sending armies to slaughter each other, he proposed something radical: a duel of champions. 3 Roman brothers, the Horatii, would fight 3 Alban brothers, the Curiatii, with the winner's city claiming supremacy. It was a gamble wrapped in pageantry, a way to settle scores without draining the lifeblood of either people. The duel itself unfolded like a grim dance. Early historians like Livy painted it in vivid strokes: the 6 young men clashing on the dusty plain between the cities, their families watching in silent agony. At first, the Curiatii seemed unstoppable, wounding 2 Horatii mortally. But the last Roman brother, Publius, feigned retreat, splitting his pursuers apart. One by one, he turned and slaughtered them, first the wounded, then the exhausted, until only he stood panting over their bodies. The Alban king bowed to Rome's supremacy, but the cost of victory was steep. When Publius returned home, his sister wept at the sight of her dead fiancé's cloak, one of the slain Curiatii. In a rage, Publius stabbed her, snarling, "So perish any Roman woman who mourns an enemy." Even in triumph, Rome's founding myths couldn't escape the stain of familial bloodshed. This wasn't just a story about combat, it was a manifesto. By elevating single combat over mass warfare, Tullus framed violence as a sacred ritual rather than senseless butchery. The Horatii's victory became a moral lesson, that skill and cunning could outweigh brute numbers. Later Romans would point to this duel when justifying their obsession with gladiatorial games and champion warfare. But beneath the legend, historians spot curious details. The Alban king's name, Metius Fufetius, appears in early Latin inscriptions, suggesting he may have been a real figure. And the valley where the duel supposedly occurred, the Fossi Cluilii, shows signs of ancient boundary markers, perhaps relics of a long-forgotten treaty. The deeper truth might lie in Rome's relationship with Alba Longa. Archaeological evidence reveals Alba as a thriving settlement centuries before Rome, its pottery and tools far more sophisticated. Some scholars argue the dual myth masks a humbler reality, that Rome was once Alba's vassal, and the Horatii's victory symbolizes a rebellious colony overthrowing its mother city. If so, Tullus didn't just win a battle, he rewrote history, turning subjugation into supremacy. The Alban nobles were reportedly relocated to Rome's Palatine Hill, their gods absorbed into the pantheon. Like the Sabines before them, they ceased to be enemies and became ancestors. Yet Tullus's warmongering would eventually consume him. After years of victorious campaigns, a plague gripped Rome, a divine punishment, some whispered, for neglecting Numa's peaceful gods. In desperation, Tullus tried to summon Jupiter's lightning as a protective charm. The ritual went catastrophically wrong. Ancient accounts disagree on whether the god struck him dead or his own altar fire erupted in flames, but the message was clear: even kings couldn't escape the balance between war and piety. His death set the stage for a ruler who'd bridge both worlds: Ancus Marcius, Numa's grandson, a man who'd wielded spades as skillfully as swords. Under his rule, Rome wouldn't just fight for land, it would build, forging engineering marvels that turned a cluster of huts into a true city. The first great bridge across the Tiber, the fortress of Ostia guarding the river's mouth, these were monuments not to conquest but to vision. And they began with a king who understood that empires aren't just won on battlefields, but drawn in blueprints and carved in stone. Ancus Marcius stepped onto the throne with an inheritance more complex than any Roman king before him, the legacy of a warrior grandfather in Numa and a city caught between its pastoral roots and its hunger for growth. His solution, not just conquest but connection. The first wooden bridge spanning the Tiber wasn't merely a feat of engineering, it was a declaration. For centuries, Romans had relied on ferry boats or waded through treacherous shallows, their world fragmented by the river's whims. Ancus's pons sublicius, named for the sublici wooden piles driven into the riverbed, stitched those fragments together. Imagine the oar as carts rattled across its creaking planks for the first time, linking Rome's 7 hills to the salt pans of Ostia and the Etruscan trade routes beyond. This was more than lumber and rope, it was the physical manifestation of a shifting identity. Archaeologists tracing the bridge's remnants face a puzzle. The Tiber's silt has swallowed most traces, but iron nails and oak pilings found near the ancient Forum Boreum suggest a structure far sturdier than early accounts implied. The real revelation lies in what surrounded it. Excavations reveal warehouses and docks dating to Ancus's reign, proof that the bridge wasn't standalone. It anchored Rome's first planned port district. Here, Etruscan bronze mingled with Greek pottery, while Sabine shepherds bartered wool for Phoenician glass. The bridge didn't just cross water, it spanned cultures, pulling Rome into a Mediterranean network that would define its future. Yet Ancus remains overshadowed by his successors, often reduced to a footnote between the warlike Tullus and the flamboyant Tarquins. Historians debate whether he was truly Rome's 4th king or a later insertion to legitimize plebeian factions. His Marcian clan rose to prominence centuries later. But his bridge whispers otherwise. Its construction mirrors Etruscan techniques, from the interlocking wooden joints to the ritual sacrifices of livestock buried beneath its foundations. Was Ancus the first king to court Etruria's influence, planting seeds that would flower under the Tarquins? Or did later Romans retrofit his story to explain their own debt to Etruscan ingenuity? The bridge's symbolic weight only grew with time. During crises, Rome's priests would reenact a bizarre ritual, dressing straw effigies in togas and hurling them into the Tiber from the pons sublicius, a vestige of some forgotten purification rite. Even its destruction became legendary. When the Etruscan king Lars Porsena attacked Rome in the 6th century BC, the bridge was deliberately dismantled to stall his advance, its planks splintering under Roman hands. This act, later immortalized by Livy, framed the bridge as both lifeline and sacrifice, a thing worth building only to destroy for survival. Ancus's reign culminates in a paradox. He fortified the Janiculum Hill with walls, yet opened Rome's first prison, the Tullianum, a damp pit where enemies of the state choked on darkness. He expanded Rome's territory yet codified asylum laws, inviting the dispossessed to swell the city's ranks. Like his bridge, he balanced expansion and control, a tension that would define Rome's empire. As his life waned, whispers crept through the Senate halls, rumors of a brilliant Etruscan exile named Tarquinius Priscus, who'd charmed the aging king with visions of aqueducts and marble temples. The stage was set for rulers who wouldn't just cross rivers but move them. The Cumaean Sibyl's arrival in Rome was anything but ordinary. Imagine a woman weathered by centuries, or so the legends claimed, her eyes burning with divine fire as she clutched 9 leather-bound books filled with prophecies. She came not to beg an audience with King Tarquin the Elder, but to issue a challenge. The price for her sacred texts, 300 pieces of gold. When Tarquin scoffed at the sum, the Sibyl did something shocking. She burned 3 books right there in the forum, then offered the remaining 6 for the same price. Again, the king refused. 3 more books turned to ashes before Tarquin, finally unnerved, paid the original sum for the last 3 surviving volumes. This wasn't just a haggling tactic, it was performance art with cosmic stakes. Those charred fragments, stored beneath Jupiter's temple, would become Rome's most consulted, and most manipulated divine guide. What made these prophecies so indispensable? Unlike the cryptic riddles of Delphi's oracle, the Sibylline books offered specific remedies for crises, which gods to appease, which rituals to enact. When plague struck, they prescribed new temples. When Hannibal's elephants crossed the Alps, they demanded the exotic Great Mother goddess Cybele be brought from Anatolia. The books weren't just scripture, they were a divine playbook, blending Greek mysticism with Roman pragmatism. Scholars note the Sibyl's verses borrowed heavily from Homeric hymns, yet were delivered in Latin hexameter, a linguistic alchemy that made foreign wisdom feel homegrown. But behind the mystique lay raw politics. The priestly college guarding the books, the quindecimviri, were no hermits, they were senators in sacred garb. Historians like Livy admit the books were often interpreted to align with senatorial agendas. When Rome needed an excuse to confiscate wealth from temples, the Sibyl commanded it. When generals sought divine backing for risky campaigns, her verses suddenly brimmed with favorable omens. The line between divine will and statecraft blurred so completely that even skeptics played along. Cicero, who privately mocked augurs, still publicly consulted the books during his consulship. The Sibyl's greatest test came during the Punic Wars. With Carthage's forces at the gates, her prophecies demanded unthinkable sacrifices, live burials of Greek and Gaulish prisoners in the Forum Boarium. Yet these grim rituals coincided neatly with Rome's need to terrify rebellious provinces. Later, when the books predicted that only a foreign-born leader could save Rome, it paved the way for Scipio Africanus, a general with Spanish ties, to take command. Coincidence or celestial cover for backroom deals? The genius of the Sibyl legend was its flexibility. As Rome expanded, new Sibyls appeared: Tiburtine, Erythraean, each updating the prophecies to fit contemporary fears. By Augustus's reign, the original Cumaean scrolls had decayed into illegibility, yet their authority endured. The emperor had them replaced with carefully edited copies, purging uncomfortable predictions about civil wars while adding flattering nods to his divine lineage. The Sibyl, it seemed, was always one step ahead or one step behind, depending on who held the pen. This dance between myth and power reached its peak under Tarquin's descendants. His grandson, Tarquin the Proud, would wield religion like a weapon, commissioning the Sibyl's priests to declare his rivals cursed. But the same prophecies that propped up kings would soon undo them. When Tarquin's son Sextus raped the noblewoman Lucretia, her suicide sparked a revolt, and conveniently, the Sibyl's books were rediscovered to predict the monarchy's fall. The stage was set for Brutus to rally Rome under a new banner, the Republic. Yet even then, the charred fragments of Tarquin's bargain endured, whispering that in Rome, the divine and the political were never truly separate. Tarquin the Proud's reign began with blood, his fathers murdered by assassins to secure his throne, and ended with an act so vile it would ignite revolution. The spark, his son Sextus's crime against Lucretia, a noblewoman whose name would echo through history as both martyr and myth. Picture her that final night, weaving by lamplight in her Palatine villa, the wool sliding through her fingers as her husband's kinsman Sextus entered uninvited. Ancient accounts differ on whether he threatened her with a sword or blackmail, but the outcome was the same, a violation that would transform private shame into political fire. When Lucretia summoned her family the next morning, her robe torn, her face ashen, she didn't plead for vengeance. She demanded witness. Then, before their horrified eyes, she plunged a dagger into her heart, her last words searing the air: "No woman shall use Lucretia as her example of dishonor." This wasn't just suicide, it was political theater. Livy's account paints Lucretia's death as the catalyst that unified Rome's patricians and plebeians against Tarquin's tyranny. Her blood staining the floor became a symbol of corrupted virtue, her body a rallying point for revolution. Yet modern scholars peel back layers of this legend. Some note striking parallels between Lucretia and earlier Greek heroines like the Spartan Cynisca, who also used self-sacrifice to spark rebellion. Others point to archaeological silence. No contemporary inscriptions mention her, only later Republican-era texts. Was Lucretia a real woman or a composite crafted to justify regime change? The truth may lie between. Rome's early records were oral traditions reshaped by generations of storytellers. What matters isn't factual accuracy, but the power the story held. The themes here transcend antiquity. When Brutus, Lucretia's kinsman, waved her bloody robe in the Forum, swearing to overthrow the Tarquins, he wasn't just avenging a family wrong. He was invoking a concept that would resonate through the ages, that tyranny justifies revolution. Fast forward to 18th century America, where pamphleteers compared King George Roman III to Tarquin, casting colonists as modern Brutuses. The same parallels surfaced during the French Revolution, with Marie Antoinette's alleged excesses framed as a new Lucretia moment. Even the dagger imagery endured. Note the stylized knives on revolutionary flags from Rome to Caracas. But the legend's darkest irony lies in its aftermath. Brutus, having expelled the Tarquins, became Rome's first consul, only to execute his own sons for plotting to restore the monarchy. The man who championed liberty became an enforcer of brutal order, proving revolutions often consume their architects. Meanwhile, the Sibylline books, those same scrolls Tarq, when the elder had bargained for, were consulted to legitimize the new republic. The oracle, it seemed, had the last laugh. As the dust settled, Rome faced its greatest experiment, self-rule without kings. The republic's founding myths would now be written not in royal edicts, but in senatorial debates and plebeian protests. Yet the shadow of the Tarquins lingered. Every consul who walked past Lucretia's memorial shrine was reminded power unchecked could topple even eternal Rome. And so the Republic's first law wasn't about taxes or treaties, but about arrogance. They called it superbia, the crime of Tarquin's pride, punishable by exile. It was a warning etched into the state's foundation. No one man should ever again hold so much power. The age of kings was over. The age of legends, however, had just begun. Horatius Cockle stood alone on the Tiber's wooden bridge, his sword chipped, his shield splintered, and the weight of Rome's survival pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him, the last Roman soldiers scrambled to hack apart the bridge's supports, buying precious seconds against the advancing Etruscan horde. Ahead, King Lars Porsena army roared like a tidal wave, their bronze helmets glinting in the dawn light. This wasn't just a battle, it was a moment etched into legend where one man's defiance would become the Republic's founding myth of courage. As the timbers groaned and the river rushed beneath him, Horatius didn't flinch. He bellowed a challenge to the enemy, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Who among you dares to take Rome from me?" The story, immortalized by Livy and later poets, reads like a script for the ultimate underdog. Horatius, a lesser-known officer with no royal blood or divine lineage, held the bridge just long enough for his comrades to sever its spine. When the structure collapsed into the Tiber, he plunged into the currents fully armored, swimming to safety as Etruscan arrows sliced the water around him. The tale's symbolism was irresistible to a young republic desperate for heroes. Here was a common soldier outperforming kings, his loyalty to Rome outweighing self-preservation. But dig deeper, and the legend reveals layers of political theater. The bridge itself, the pons sublicius built by Ancus Marcius, was a sacred relic. its destruction a ritual act as much as a tactical one. By framing Horatius's stand as both strategic and holy, Rome turned a military retreat into a moral victory. Compare this to history's other great last stands. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans faced Persia's millions in a narrow pass, their sacrifice immortalized as the epitome of martial honor. Yet the Spartan stand was aristocratic, a brotherhood of warrior kings defending their way of life. Horatius's act was democratic, a lone everyman defending an idea. The Romans didn't just admire his bravery, they institutionalized it. Centuries later, emperors would award soldiers the corona obsidianalis, a grass crown for those who saved entire legions, a direct echo of Horatius's myth. Even the bridge's ruins became a pilgrimage site, where generals would pause before wars, drawing strength from the spot where one man's defiance had bought a city's future. But legends often hide inconvenient truths. Some accounts suggest Horatius wasn't alone, that two comrades stood with him, their names lost to time. Others hint the Etruscans weren't repelled but negotiated with, their king Porsena later aiding Rome against rival tribes. The real genius of the Horatius myth wasn't its accuracy but its adaptability. For soldiers, it was a lesson in discipline. For politicians, a parable about the individual's duty to the state. And for enemies, a warning that Rome would burn its own bridges before surrendering them. As the Republic grew, so did the story's echoes. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he invoked Horatius's spirit, not as a defender, but as a disruptor, turning the myth on its head. Renaissance artists like Machiavelli saw in Horatius the perfect citizen soldier, while Enlightenment thinkers debated whether his sacrifice glorified tyranny. The bridge itself was rebuilt and destroyed repeatedly, each iteration a metaphor for Rome's resilience. Today, a plaque near the Tiber marks the supposed spot, though no physical trace remains. Perhaps that's fitting. Horatius's true legacy isn't in wood or stone, but in the idea that a single act of courage can ripple through centuries. Yet for all its glory, the Horatius myth also exposed Rome's limits. Brute strength and patriotism couldn't solve every crisis. As the Republic faced cunning foes like Carthage, it would need a new kind of hero, one who fought with wit as much as steel. Enter the next legend, where a starving plebeian named Scaevola would teach Rome that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't a sword, but a hand held steady in the fire. Gaius Mucius Cordus crept through the Etruscan camp by moonlight, his dagger cold against his wrist and his heartbeat drowning out the distant laughter of enemy soldiers. The young Roman noble had volunteered for an impossible mission, to assassinate King Lars Porsena himself, the warlord besieging Rome with a hunger to restore the exiled Tarquins. But when Mucius mistook Porsena's secretary for the king and drove his blade into the wrong man, the camp erupted in chaos. Dragged before the actual monarch, Mucius didn't beg for mercy. He thrust his right hand into the nearest altar fire and held it there, flesh sizzling, as he declared, "See how little those who despise pain care for your threats." The stunned Etruscans nicknamed him Scaevola, Lefty, and in that moment, a legend was forged from agony and defiance. This wasn't just a story about toughness. Mucius's act epitomized disciplina, the Roman ideal of self-mastery so absolute it bordered on the fanatical. Where Greek heroes like Achilles raged against fate, Roman heroes subdued even their own instincts. Historians note the irony. Mucius failed his mission yet won a psychological victory. Porsena, shaken by such resolve, reportedly sued for peace, sparing Rome from annihilation. The tale became a masterclass in turning defeat into propaganda, proof that Roman spirit could outlast steel. But how much of this actually happened? Archaeologists find no record of Porsena's siege ending this way, though his forces did withdraw mysteriously. The burning hand motif echoes older Near Eastern rituals where priests proved devotion through self-harm. Even Mucius's name hints at fabrication. Cordus means late born, often given to mythical figures. The deeper truth may lie in the story's timing. Told and retold during the Republic's crises, it served as a mirror for Rome's elites. When senators debated raising peasant armies against invaders, Mucius's tale reminded them, true strength came from sacrifice, not birthright. The legend's afterlife is even more revealing. Renaissance artists like Rubens painted Mucius not as a patriot but as a Christian martyr precursor, his smoldering hand foreshadowing saints' trials. Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu mocked the story as barbaric, while Napoleon's officers invoked it to justify suicidal charges. Today, psychologists might diagnose Mucius as exhibiting appraisal distortion, reframing torture as empowerment. Yet for ancient Romans, his lesson was clear. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the will to act through it. This ethos bled from battlefield to politics. As the Republic matured, discipline shaped its most brutal institutions. The censors who stripped wayward senators of rank, the fathers who could legally execute disobedient sons, all claimed Mucius's legacy. Even Rome's famed legalism sprang from this ideal, with consuls submitting to term limits as dutifully as soldiers followed orders. But the cracks showed quickly. When plebeians demanded land reform, patricians cited discipline to justify repression, sparking riots. The same virtue that saved Rome from Porsena now threatened to tear it apart from within. Mucius's shadow loomed especially large during the conflict of the orders, the century-long class war that pitted wealthy patricians against indebted plebeians. The plebs, tired of fighting Rome's wars only to return to confiscated farms, staged the ultimate protest in 494 BC. They marched out of the city en masse, leaving patricians to govern empty streets. This secessio plebis wasn't just a strike, it was Mucius's lesson inverted. Where he endured pain for the state, the plebs withheld labor until the state endured their demands. The standoff birthed the tribune of the plebs, an office sacrosanct as the altar Mucius burned himself upon. Yet the contradictions multiplied. Rome's greatest strength, its ability to turn enemies into citizens, now strained under internal divisions. The very discipline that forged empire couldn't resolve who should reap its rewards. As the Republic lurched from crisis to crisis, another legend would emerge. This time not of a single hero's hand in flames, but of an entire people's hunger. The tragic tale of Spurius Maelius and the grain dole that cost him his life. The name Coriolanus still echoes with a particular kind of Roman tragedy, not of a man felled by enemies, but one unraveled by his own pride and the unbearable tension between love for family and loyalty to state. Born Caius Marcius, he earned his famous surname through sheer brutality on the battlefield, storming the Volscian city of Corioli in 490 BC with such ferocity that Rome hailed him as a hero. But Rome's gratitude was fickle. When famine struck and grain shipments arrived from Sicily, Coriolanus, now a senator, argued for withholding food from the plebeians unless they surrendered their hard-won political rights. The mob turned on him instantly, accusing him of treason and banishing him from the city gates with stones and curses. What followed wasn't just revenge, it was a psychological masterpiece. The exiled general defected to Rome's bitter enemies, the Volscians, and led their army to the very walls of his homeland, ready to reduce it to ashes. Here's where the legend takes its gut-wrenching turn. As the Volscians prepared to torch Rome's suburbs, a delegation of senators arrived to plead for mercy and failed. Then came the priests in their sacred robes, shaking talismans of the gods, another failure. Finally, a ripple moved through the Volscian ranks, a group of women approaching, led by Coriolanus's aged mother Vetria, his wife Volumnia clutching their children's hands. Without a word, Vetria sank to her knees in the dirt. The hardened general who'd shrugged off threats and divine omens now trembled. Livy's account sears the moment into memory. Must I see you kneeling, mother, and not feel my bones turn to water? The man who'd built his life on uncompromising discipline crumpled, calling off the attack. The Volscians, cheated of their prize, later assassinated him, but Rome, ever pragmatic, erected a temple to Fortuna Mulibris, the fortune of women, honoring the power of maternal intervention. Shakespeare's retelling 4 centuries later amplifies every raw nerve of this story. His Coriolanus is less a hero or villain than a force of nature, his contempt for the plebeians so visceral it borders on the pathological. They said they were an hungry, sighed forth proverbs that hunger broke stone walls that dogs must eat. He snarls, mocking their suffering. Yet Shakespeare adds layers the ancients never explored. Scenes of Vetria molding her son into a weapon from childhood, her pride in his wounds more maternal than merciful. When she finally confronts him outside Rome, her rhetoric is a masterclass in emotional warfare. "Thou art my warrior, I holp to frame thee," she reminds him, reducing the conqueror to a chastened boy. The play's genius lies in its ambiguity. Is Coriolanus's surrender a redemption or a final defeat? Beneath the drama, the myth grapples with questions that haunted Rome for centuries. Can a state survive when its greatest defenders despise its people? How far should loyalty to class or family outweigh duty to country? Coriolanus's banishment wasn't just personal, it mirrored real fractures in the young republic. The same plebeians he scorned had recently won the right to elect tribunes after their mass secession to the Sacred Mount. His story became a cautionary tale for aristocrats who couldn't adapt to a changing Rome where brute strength alone couldn't govern. Yet the tale's endurance speaks to something universal. Freud famously analyzed Coriolanus as the epitome of the Oedipal struggle, the son whose ambition is both fueled and undone by maternal influence. Modern adaptations recast him as everything from a whistleblower crushed by bureaucracy to a fascist demagogue. What resonates isn't the historical details. The Volscian campaign is likely embellished, but the unbearable choices it forces into the light. When Coriolanus hesitates before his mother, he isn't just a Roman, he's every person torn between private love and public identity, between vengeance and belonging. This tension between collective and individual would shape Rome's next great crisis, the conflict of the orders. If Coriolanus's tragedy was one man's clash with democracy, the coming struggles would pit entire classes against each other, not with swords but with strikes, legal maneuvering, and the first whispers of wealth redistribution. The plebeians who once cowered before Coriolanus's scorn were about to find their voice, and their weapon wouldn't be a general's spear, but something far more potent, the power of collective refusal. The Palatine Hill erupted not with the clash of swords, but with the deafening silence of empty streets, a protest so powerful it brought Rome to its knees without a single drop of blood spilled. In 494 BC, the plebeians, Rome's backbone of laborers and soldiers, made history not by marching into battle, but by marching out of the city entirely. Tired of fighting patrician wars only to return to confiscated farms and crushing debt, they abandoned their shops, forges, and plows, flooding the Aventine like a human tide. Their demand, not grain or gold, but something far more radical, a voice. Ancient historians like Livy painted this secessio plebis as a noble stand for justice, the downtrodden plebs withdrawing to the Sacred Mount, where they swore oaths of solidarity under the open sky. But modern scholars scrape away the myth to reveal a far messier reality. The Aventine wasn't some pristine campground. It was a slum-riddled district where plebeians already clustered, its slopes littered with the bones of those who'd starved during patrician-controlled grain shortages. The protest was likely less a coordinated exodus and more a desperate occupation, with families huddling in makeshift shelters as patrician envoys scrambled to negotiate. The genius of the plebeian strategy lay in its simplicity. By withholding labor, they paralyzed a city that relied on their hands to grind flour, forge weapons, and tend livestock. Even the army faltered, its ranks filled with plebeians who refused to fight for a state that denied them rights. The patricians, suddenly facing empty markets and unmanned defenses, had no choice but to concede. The result, the creation of the tribune of the plebs, an office so sacred that harming its holders was declared a capital crime. These tribunes could veto patrician laws, intervene in arrests, and even halt conscription, a seismic shift in Rome's power structure. But how peaceful was this revolution really? Later Roman writers, eager to glorify their ancestors, scrubbed the record clean of violence, yet fragments of older texts hint at darker undercurrents. A cryptic passage in Dionysius of Halicarnassus mentions fires on the Aventine, while pottery shards found near the hill's ancient springs bear scratched curses against patrician families. Some historians speculate the secession included targeted sabotage, grain stores spoiled, aqueducts blocked, acts later sanitized into passive resistance. The truth may lie in between, a movement that began with solemn oaths but escalated as hunger and frustration mounted. The patricians' response reveals their fear. They didn't just grant political concessions, they weaponized religion to legitimize the new order. The plebeians' oath swearing on the Aventine was reframed as a sacred pact with Jupiter himself, their demands transformed into divine will. This wasn't generosity, it was damage control. By spiritualizing the conflict, the elite ensured their surrender appeared not as weakness but as piety. Even the tribune's sacrosanct status served their interests. It made plebeian leaders easier to identify and manipulate, yet the secession's legacy endured. For centuries, whenever plebeians felt betrayed, they'd threaten to go to the Aventine again, a phrase that chilled patrician spines. The hill itself became a symbol of resistance, its slopes later housing temples to plebeian-friendly gods like Ceres, whose cults distributed free grain. Modern parallels abound, from Gandhi's Salt March to the Solidarity strikes in Poland, but Rome's protest stands apart in one eerie detail. According to legend, as the plebeians prepared to return to the city, a disembodied voice boomed from the sacred mount, warning of future strife. The next crisis wouldn't be solved by negotiation or oaths, but by something far more unsettling. A phantom army materializing from thin air, ready to defend Rome when no living soldier would. The night was moonless over Rome, the air thick with the stench of Gallic campfires burning just beyond the shattered gates. The year was 390 BCE, and the once proud city lay in ruins, its legions defeated, its people fled or enslaved, its sacred temples stripped of gold. Only the Palatine Hill remained, a lone island of resistance where Rome's last defenders huddled behind crumbling walls. The Gauls, sensing victory, moved like shadows up the cliffs, their bare feet silent on the stone. Then, just as the first warrior's hand gripped the summit's edge, the darkness exploded with a sound no one expected, the furious honking of geese. These weren't just any geese. They were the sacred birds of Juno, kept fat and noisy in her temple precincts despite the siege-starvation rations. Their shrieks tore through the night, rousing the sleeping Romans just in time to hurl the invaders back into the void. The Gauls, stunned by the avian alarm, retreated, giving Rome's defenders precious hours to regroup. By dawn, the legend was born, the city saved not by swords or strategy, but by the vigilance of Juno's feathered guardians. But let's peel back the feathers. Why Geese? Roman writers like Livy framed it as divine intervention, Juno's sacred animals acting as her proxies. Yet geese were practical choices for temple guards. Unlike dogs, they don't sleep deeply, and their aggression toward intruders is legendary. Medieval castles would later use them for the same reason. The real miracle might have been that the starving Romans hadn't eaten them yet. Some historians suspect the story masks a clever ruse, sentries mimicking goose calls to fake reinforcements, or priests releasing the birds as living alarm systems. Either way, the tales humor mighty Gauls bested by barnyard fowl, let Romans laugh through the trauma of their city's near destruction. The Geese's legacy endured far beyond that night. Their annual procession through Rome became a carnival of gratitude, with golden feathered birds paraded like conquering generals. Juno's temple, already revered as the city's spiritual stronghold, gained new fame as the savior's sanctuary. Even the Gauls got a backhanded tribute, their failed stealth attack immortalized in Latin as the Silentium Gallicum, a phrase later used for any botched covert operation. Yet beneath the whimsy lies a darker truth. The siege aftermath saw Rome rebuild not just its walls, but its identity. The Gauls' near victory exposed fatal flaws in the Republic's defenses, sparking military reforms that would later forge the legionary machine. And the Geese, they became a metaphor for Rome itself, seemingly frivolous, unexpectedly fierce, and fiercely protected by the gods. This blend of divine whim and mortal grit sets the stage for our next legend, where heroism shifts from the collective to the individual. Picture a lone soldier standing against an entire army, his name lost to time but his deed etched forever in the annals of sacrifice. The story of the unknown bridge defender who held the line while Rome burned behind him. Sometimes history remembers not the clatter of 1,000 swords, but the echo of one. The plow stood motionless in the field, its wooden handles still warm from the calloused hands that had gripped it moments before. Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus barely had time to wipe the dirt from his brow when the senators found him, their togas stark white against the muted greens of his farm. Rome was under siege. The Equi tribe had trapped their armies in the Alban hills, and the Republic, in panic, had taken a drastic step, reviving the office of dictator. Not as we think of dictators today, but as a temporary savior granted absolute power for 6 months. The senators expected pleading, bargaining. Instead, Cincinnatus simply nodded, kissed his wife, and walked toward the city without looking back. What happened next became the gold standard of Roman virtue. In 16 days, not 6 months, Cincinnatus crushed the Equi, freed the trapped legions, and resigned his dictatorship. No triumphal parade, no clinging to power, just a man returning to his plow as if he'd merely stepped away to mend a fence. The story, passed down by Livy and Plutarch, reads like a moral fable. But its real power lies in the details. Cincinnatus didn't just save Rome, he rejected the very allure of power that would later corrupt the Republic. His 4-acre farm, small even by ancient standards, became a pilgrimage site. Its humble furrows proof that greatness wasn't measured in land or titles, but in knowing when to let go. George Washington, an avid reader of Roman history, consciously mirrored Cincinnatus when he resigned his military commission after the Revolutionary War, an act so shocking that King George Roman III reportedly called him the greatest man in the world. The Society of the Cincinnati, founded by Washington's officers, took its name and ethos directly from the Roman legend. Even the fasces, those bundled rods symbolizing authority that Cincinnatus willingly surrendered appear in the U.S. House of Representatives, a silent tribute to the ideal of temporary power. But how much of the legend is rooted in reality? Archaeologists note that 5th century BCE Rome lacked the bureaucracy to support a sudden dictatorship. Some scholars argue Cincinnatus was a later invention, his story retrofitted during the Republic's crises to shame power-hungry senators. Others point to his name, Cincinnatus, meaning curly-haired, as possible satire, poking fun at aristocratic vanity. Yet pottery shards found near the Tiber bear crude sketches of a farmer with a plow and sword, suggesting the tale had entered popular lore long before Livy's pen touched parchment. The myth's endurance reveals an uncomfortable truth. Rome rarely lived up to Cincinnatus's example. Within generations, dictators like Sulla would use the office to purge rivals, and Julius Caesar's infamous refusal to step down shattered the precedent forever. Perhaps that's why the story resonated so deeply, not as history but as collective guilt. The Romans knew they'd strayed from the ideal, and Cincinnatus became their North Star, a reminder of what they'd lost. This tension between myth and reality set the stage for Rome's next chapter, expansion. If Cincinnatus embodied restraint, the coming era would test whether a republic built on humility could survive the temptations of empire. The plow he left behind would soon be overshadowed by the gleam of distant gold, and the legends that followed would trade the simplicity of a farmer's virtue for the epic scale of conquest. The road to the Caudine Forks seemed harmless enough, a narrow mountain pass winding through the Apennines, its limestone walls dappled with late summer sunlight. The Roman consuls, Titus Veturius Calvinus and Spurius Postumius Albinus, led their legions forward with the confidence of men who'd never known true defeat. They were chasing the Samnites, Rome's fierce rivals in central Italy, who'd reportedly fled in disarray. But as the last Roman soldiers stepped into the gorge's narrowest point, the trap snapped shut. Rocks and timber crashed down behind them, sealing the exit. Ahead, the Samnites' freshly built wall loomed, bristling with spears. In that moment, 40,000 Roman soldiers realized the unthinkable. They weren't the hunters. They were the prey. What followed wasn't just a military disaster. It was a ritual humiliation seared into Rome's collective memory. The Samnite leader Gaius Pontius could have slaughtered the trapped legions. Instead, he offered terms so deliberately degrading they cut deeper than any sword. The Romans would surrender their weapons, strip to their tunics, and pass under the yoke, a symbolic arch of spears forcing them to crouch like slaves. Livy's account lingers on the details, the clatter of discarded armor, the silent tears of battle-hardened centurions, the way even the Samnite soldiers turned away, ashamed to witness such naked disgrace. This wasn't merely defeat, it was the unraveling of an entire mythology of Roman invincibility. The psychological shockwaves rippled for generations. The Caudine Forks became shorthand for reckless overconfidence, taught to young officers as a masterclass in what not to do. The consuls had ignored scouts' warnings about the terrain, dismissed omens from sacrificed animals, and marched blindly into a textbook ambush. But the real lesson lay in what came next. Unlike other cultures that might have collapsed under such shame, Rome transformed humiliation into fuel. Within a decade, the same legions that crawled under the yoke would crush the Samnites at the Battle of Bovianum, their revenge so complete it erased the stain of the Forks from public memory, almost. Compare this to Hannibal's victory at Cannae over a century later. Both were catastrophic defeats, yet Rome's responses couldn't have been more different. After Cannae, the Senate famously refused to ransom captured soldiers, declaring they deserved their fate for surrendering, but the Caudine Forks captives. They were welcomed back, their disgrace shared collectively as a national trauma rather than individual failure. The difference reveals a key truth. Early Rome could absorb shame as motivation, while the later Republic saw surrender as existential threat. The yoke itself took on a paradoxical symbolism. Originally a Samnite insult, Rome later repurposed it as a ritual of their own, forcing defeated enemies to pass beneath spears as psychological warfare. The very act meant to break them became a tool of dominance. You can trace this reversal in archaeological finds across Italy. Samnite coins minted after Bovianum show warriors kneeling, while Roman ones depict unbroken legionary eagles. The message was clear: what didn't destroy Rome would only arm it for vengeance. By the time Julius Caesar used the yoke to humiliate Gauls at Alesia, the Caudine Forks had faded into legend. But its core lesson endured in Rome's darkest hours. That survival sometimes required swallowing pride to fight another day. The pass itself still cuts through the mountains near modern-day Montesarchio, its quiet beauty belying the ancient echoes of clanking swords and muffled sobs. Standing there today, you can almost hear the ghosts whispering the Republic's unspoken creed that no defeat is final until you stop learning from it. This relentless adaptability set the stage for Rome's greatest conquests. The same legions once brought low in the Apennines would soon march across continents, their standards casting shadows from Britain to Babylon. But before they could dominate the Mediterranean, they had to face a threat far closer to home, a rival so formidable it would take not just soldiers, but engineers, diplomats, and sheer stubbornness to overcome. The legend of the Samnite Wars was about to give way to an even greater struggle, the Pyrrhic victories that would teach Rome the cost of empire. The night air over Carthage was thick with the scent of salt and burning cedar when Scipio Africanus slipped into a dream so vivid it would haunt Rome's imagination for centuries. There, among the swirling constellations, stood his dead grandfather Scipio the Elder, bathed in celestial light. With a sweep of his arm, the elder Scipio parted the starscape like a curtain, revealing the future, not just of Rome, but of the boy who would one day crush Hannibal. "See how small your earthly struggles seem from here," the vision whispered, "for your destiny is written in the music of the spheres." This wasn't just a soldier's midnight fancy. Cicero would later immortalize it in The Dream of Scipio, transforming a general's private vision into a philosophical blueprint for empire. Beneath the dream's shimmering surface flowed currents of Neoplatonism, the Greek philosophy then mesmerizing Rome's elite. The idea of a cosmic hierarchy, with earthly realms shadowing perfect celestial forms, gave divine weight to Scipio's conquests. When the dream promised eternal fame to those who served Rome's glory, it mirrored Plato's Republic, where philosophers glimpsed absolute truth. But there was a crucial difference. Where Plato's visions urged contemplation, Scipio's demanded action. The stars themselves seemed to command imperialism as holy duty. Archaeologists find echoes of this in coins minted after Carthage's fall. Scipio's profile wreathed in radiate crowns, mimicking the sun god Apollo. The message was clear: victory wasn't just strategy, it was cosmology. Yet the dream's timing raises thorny questions. Scipio claimed it came before his decisive African campaign, but whispers circulated that he'd only revealed it after triumphing at Zama. Was this celestial theater a calculated stroke of propaganda? Roman generals weren't above inventing omens. Sulla famously carried a little Apollo figurine that spoke battle advice through a hidden ventriloquist. But Scipio's lifelong fascination with Greek philosophy suggests another possibility, that he genuinely believed the dream, blurring the line between mysticism and ambition. His library, later looted by rivals, reportedly held annotated scrolls of Plato's Timaeus. its margins crammed with notes on soul migration and cosmic order. The dream's legacy outlived Scipio by centuries. Augustus would stage his own celestial visions to justify imperial rule, while Renaissance painters like Raphael depicted the dream as a metaphor for Rome's divine mandate. But its most chilling adaptation came from Mussolini's fascists, who plastered Cicero's text in schools to glorify conquest. The stars that once inspired Scipio had become a weapon. As the last embers of Carthage faded, Rome stood poised between light and shadow. The same cosmic certainty that fueled Scipio's dream would soon curdle into darker visions, prophecies of blood-soaked togas and brothers turning blades on each other. The Republic's golden age was dawning, but its myths were already whispering of twilight. The sacrificial bull's entrails spilled across the temple floor in a grotesque tangle, the priest's hands trembling as he traced the malformed liver, a blackened, shriveled thing that should have gleamed with health. Days before Julius Caesar's murder, such omens piled up like storm clouds, horses weeping blood outside the Rubicon, phantom armies clashing in the northern skies, and most chilling of all, Caesar's own wife Calpurnia waking in a sweat, screaming that she'd held his murdered body in her arms. These weren't just superstitions, they were psychological landmines in a society where divination was statecraft. When the Haruspex Spurina warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March, he wasn't making a poetic prediction. He was invoking an ancient Etruscan tradition where deformed organs signaled divine wrath. The dictator shrugged it off, but Rome's collective imagination didn't. Shakespeare's genius was to weaponize these omens into a narrative time bomb. His soothsayer doesn't just murmur warnings, he locks eyes with Caesar in the forum, slicing through the crowd's noise with that razor-sharp line, "Beware the Ides of March." The playwright takes historical scraps of Plutarch's note about a parchment warning thrust into Caesar's hand, Cicero's letters mentioning nightmares, and weaves them into a relentless drumbeat of doom. By Act Roman 3, even the audience, who knows what's coming, leans forward as the clock ticks toward March 15th. The storm that night isn't just weather, it's the gods themselves howling over Pompey's statue, where Caesar's blood will soon pool. Shakespeare's Rome isn't a place where men kill a tyrant, it's where the universe demands sacrifice. But why did these myths stick so fiercely? Psychologists suggest they served as trauma buffers. Caesar's death wasn't just a political murder, it shattered Rome's illusion of stability, sparking 14 years of civil war. By framing it as fated, by having Caesar himself ignore Apollo's own warnings, the story gave chaos meaning. It transformed brutish daggers in the Senate House into instruments of cosmic balance. Even the conspirators leaned into this, staging the killing at Pompey's feet like a twisted ritual, as if the gods had choreographed revenge for Pompey's defeat at Pharsalus. The imperial era would twist these omens into propaganda. Augustus, Caesar's heir, didn't just avenge his adoptive father, he weaponized the Ides mystique. Coins minted after the wars showed Caesar's comet, the Sidus Iulium, blazing over his temple, recasting the murder as a necessary step toward apotheosis. The message was clear: Caesar had to die so Rome could be reborn under divine mandate. The same omens that once heralded doom now sanctified empire, yet beneath the myth-making, a darker truth flickers. Many omens were likely retrofitted after the fact. Cicero, writing just weeks after the assassination, mentions no bleeding horses or prophetic dreams. It's only decades later, in historians like Suetonius, that the supernatural crescendo appears. This wasn't accidental. Augustus's regime needed Caesar's death to feel inevitable, not like a preventable tragedy that exposed Rome's fragility. The ghosts and portents became narrative glue, holding together a fractured state's identity. As the imperial cult took root, the ideas of March morphed again. What began as a warning became a holiday die Caesaris, where citizens pinned handwritten verses to Pompey's statue, debating whether Brutus was hero or villain. The ghosts of Caesar's legend had done their job. They'd turned raw trauma into national myth, a story flexible enough to justify empire yet haunting enough to remind emperors that no ruler, however mighty, was beyond the reach of fate's dagger. Augustus didn't just rule Rome, he staged a celestial revolution, and Apollo was his co-conspirator. The story begins in the chaos of Actium's aftermath, where the young Octavian, fresh from crushing Antony and Cleopatra, stood before a battered Senate and declared something audacious. The god Apollo himself had whispered victory in his ear mid-battle. Not Mars, Rome's traditional patron of war, but the Greek god of light and reason. This wasn't just a change of divine sponsorship, it was a rebranding of empire. Apollo's association with order, art, and prophecy allowed Augustus to frame his reign not as another bloody dictatorship, but as a divinely ordained renaissance. Coins minted in the years after Actium tell the tale: Apollo's lyre replacing swords, his laurel wreath encircling the words, Augustus, son of the divine. The genius of this myth-making lay in its layers. Augustus didn't simply claim Apollo's favor, he embedded it in Rome's physical landscape. On the Palatine Hill, where Romulus once traced Rome's first sacred boundary, Augustus built a sprawling temple to Apollo right next to his own home, their foundations literally intertwined. Visitors walking its marble halls would see statues of the god sculpted with Augustus's features, their faces eerily alike. Even the Sibylline books, those ancient prophecies Tarquin the Elder had bargained for centuries earlier, were suddenly rediscovered with new verses foretelling a golden age under a Prince of Peace. Convenient timing, considering Augustus's poets were already drafting Virgil's Aeneid, which cast him as the long-prophesied descendant of Aeneas, destined to rule a world without end. But how many Romans truly bought this celestial PR campaign? Letters from the period reveal a fascinating mix of awe and eye-rolling. The poet Ovid, ever the skeptic, wrote sly verses about gods who conveniently vacationed in politicians' dreams, while graffiti in Pompeii joked about Apollo trading in his lyre for a tax collector's ledger. Yet archaeology tells another story. Excavations of humble homes from Gaul to Greece show Lararium's household shrines, where Augustus's likeness stood beside Apollo's, proof that the propaganda seeped deep into daily worship. This wasn't blind belief, but something more pragmatic, a collective decision to embrace the myth because stability was worth the suspension of disbelief. The Aeneid became the linchpin of this manufactured destiny. Virgil's epic didn't just flatter Augustus, it rewrote Rome's origin story to make his rule inevitable. In Book 6, Aeneas descends into the underworld and sees a parade of future heroes culminating in Augustus, whose reign would bring an age where the gates of war swing shut and justice returns. The irony was delicious, a poem celebrating peace, commissioned by a man who'd risen to power through civil war. Yet the Aeneid's true brilliance lay in its ambiguity. When Jupiter promises empire without end, is it a blessing or a curse? The final lines of the poem, where Aeneas kills his surrendering foe Turnus in a fit of rage, leave the question hanging: is this golden age truly divine, or just another cycle of violence gilded in verse? That tension between promise and reality shadows Augustus's final legend. As he lay dying in 14 CE, Rome buzzed with rumors of his last words, "Did I play my part well?" It was the perfect exit line for an emperor who treated his reign as cosmic theater. But beneath the stagecraft lurked a darker prophecy. The same Sibylline books that heralded his golden age also contained a cryptic warning that Rome's dominion would last 1,200 years, then perish by fire and flood. Augustus had spent a lifetime selling hope, yet even his myth-making couldn't silence the whispers of apocalypse. The curtain was falling on his carefully crafted era of light, and somewhere in the wings, history waited with a torch. The Sibyl's last prophecy arrived not as a whisper, but as a scream, a final, chilling verse in the crumbling pages of Rome's most sacred texts. As the empire teetered on the edge of collapse, the keepers of the Sibylline books unearthed a line that froze the blood of even the most hardened senators. Rome shall rule 1,200 years, then drown in fire and flood. The timing couldn't have been more ominous. Calculated from the city's mythical founding in 753 BC, the deadline fell squarely in the 5th century CE, the very moment Visigoth armies battered the gates. To a civilization that had built its identity on eternity, these words weren't just a prediction, they were a self-fulfilling curse. Yet the prophecy's true power lay in its ambiguity. Early Christian writers like Augustine seized on it, recasting Rome's fall not as an ending, but as divine punishment for pagan sins. In the City of God, Augustine twisted the Sibyl's warning into a theological weapon. The eternal city wasn't meant to last because true permanence belonged only to heaven. The irony was exquisite, a pagan oracle now fueling Christian triumphalism. Even the fire and flood imagery found new life in medieval art, where mosaics in Ravenna depicted Rome's demise as a baptism of chaos, washing away the old world for the new. But history, as always, refused to follow the script. While the Western Empire fractured, the East endured. Constantinople, that glittering daughter of Rome, carried the imperial flame for another 1,000 years, its scholars meticulously preserving Latin texts even as the Colosseum crumbled. Then came Charlemagne in 800 CE, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in a deliberate echo of Augustus, a rebirth the Sibyl never foresaw. The prophecy's edges blurred, stretched thin by survival. Modern archaeologists trace this resilience in unexpected places. In the ruins of Roman Britain, post holes show villas rebuilt with pagan motifs beside Christian crosses. In Egypt, Coptic monks copied Virgil alongside Gospels. The empire didn't so much vanish as dissolve into the groundwater of Europe, its myths seeping into law, language, and liturgy. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, he wasn't just mimicking Charlemagne, he was channeling Romulus, Augustus, and the entire pantheon of Roman founders, their legends now distilled into pure political theater. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Sibyl's final warning. Rome's genius wasn't in defying prophecy, but in reshaping it. The city that began with a she-wolf's milk and a fratricide's plowline ended not with fire or flood, but with 1,000 rebirths, each claiming the mantle of eternity. Even now, when senators in Washington debate in neoclassical halls or the euro carries Caesar's laurels on its coins, the old myths whisper. They remind us that civilizations don't truly die when their walls fall, but when their stories stop being told. And Rome, her stories are everywhere. From the she-wolf's milk that nourished Romulus and Remus to the dying gasp of the Sibyl's prophecy, Rome's 26 founding legends aren't just stories, they're a mirror held up to the soul of an empire. These tales glorify more than heroes. They exalt the very ideals Rome wanted to believe defined it. Unbreakable discipline in the face of pain like Mucius Scivola's smoldering hand, self-sacrifice as stark as Horatius on the bridge, and civic duty so pure it could make a dictator like Cincinnatus walk away from absolute power. Yet woven between these virtues are darker threads: Remus's blood staining the first city walls, Lucretia's violated body-sparking revolution, Caesar's corpse left to bleed at the feet of Pompey's statue. Rome's myths didn't shy from paradox. They celebrated mercy and conquest, piety and betrayal, all while insisting the gods themselves willed their dominance. Look beyond the marble and gilded rhetoric, and you'll find these legends did the heavy lifting of empire building. When Augustus linked his reign to Apollo's light, or Scipio Africanus invoked celestial visions to justify crushing Carthage, they weren't just manipulating superstition, they were tapping into a narrative machine perfected over centuries. The same myths that once united shepherds and senators under Romulus's asylum banner later justified marching legions across 3 continents. Art, too, became propaganda. The Capitoline wolf wasn't merely a sculpture, it was a national logo stamped on coins and standards as a reminder that Rome's ferocity and nurturing power sprang from the same source. Even dissent got absorbed into the mythology. Coriolanus's rebellion and the Plebeians Secession became cautionary tales about the limits of ambition, ensuring every challenge to the system ultimately reinforced it. Today, these legends pulse through institutions far beyond Rome's ruins. Napoleon's laurel crowns, Washington's Cincinnatus complex, even the fasces carved into American courthouses, all whisper of a civilization that understood myth's power to shape reality. Modern nations still craft founding stories, whether it's America's cherry trees or revolutionary France's cult of liberty. But Rome's genius was in making its myths adaptable. The same she-wolf could symbolize maternal care to a first-century poet and ruthless expansion to a medieval warlord. The Sibyl's prophecies could justify pagan emperors or Christian apocalypse, depending on who held the pen. So here's the question that lingers like smoke from a sacrificed bull. Do all great civilizations need such myths to thrive? Not just as falsehoods, but as flexible, breathing narratives that justify sacrifice, soften defeats, and turn mere cities into ideas too potent to die. The irony is rich. An empire built on pragmatic roads and legal codes owed its endurance largely to stories of phantom armies and talking wolves. Maybe that's the ultimate Roman lesson. Reality is built with bricks, but legacy is written in dreams. Now it's your turn. Which Roman legend resonates most with you? The grit of Horatius, the tragedy of Coriolanus, or something darker like Tarpea's betrayal? Drop your favorite in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Who knows, the next historical mystery we unravel might just be the myth you're already living.